Well, welcome again to our online Bible study that we call Your Kingdom Come. And of course, this is taken from the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Today, our topic is the time for change. Now, what does that have to do with the kingdom of God? Well, I think as we see throughout history that things change. Things do not remain the same. There are different events that takes place throughout our lifetime and throughout the Bible. So things do not remain static except God. I mean, He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. But everything else around us can change. So we're going to be looking at the scripture from Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 through 7. And we're going to look at this story about Yaakov, about Jacob. Now, verse 1. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth. Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly towards him as formerly. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. And Yaakov, or Jacob, sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock, and said to them, I see your father's face, that is not towards me as before, but the Elohim, the mighty God of my father, has been with me. And you know that I have served your father with all my strength. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow him to hurt me. And then he goes on and talks about the different wages that his father changed on him and how the Lord responded in those situations. So we're going to be looking at this story about Yaakov, or Jacob, and Laban. And we're going to see that this story is filled with deceit, jealousy, and strife. Now, for us to really understand what's going on here, we have to go back in time, go back to the land of Canaan. This is where Jacob lived before he came to Padanaram in Syria. And we know that in the story that Jacob had deceived his aged blind father Isaac into believing that he was his twin brother Esau. And by the way, this was through the urging and the help of his mother Rebekah. I mean, she was the one that was really pushing Jacob to do this. Now, although Yaakov, or Jacob, and Esau were twins, they were certainly not identical twins by any means, in looks or characteristics, personality, or godliness. So when Isaac, his father, had given Yaakov, or Jacob, the blessing of the firstborn son. Now remember that Jacob was, even though they were twins, Jacob came out second. So he was not the firstborn. But when he tricked his father into giving him the blessing of the firstborn son, and then Esau found out about it, Esau was tore out of the frame, to use the vernacular. He was livid. He was off the chart, angry with his brother. And he made it clear to those around him that as soon as he could, he was going to kill his brother. Now, this animosity between Jacob and Esau has continued throughout the centuries, throughout the millennials. I mean, descendants of Jacob and Esau have been at odds with one another ever since this event took place. So Jacob, again prompted by his mother, decided it was time to leave home. Now they gave an excuse that they wanted Jacob to not marry one of the Canaanite women like Esau had. So they wanted him to go, Rebekah, and she talked Isaac into this. She wanted Jacob to go back to her hometown in Syria, or as it's called in the scripture, Padandrium, which was hundreds of miles away from where they were at that time. So Jacob leaves home. He's never been away from home. He's been more of a homebody type of person, not venturing out. But this was the first time that he went away from home. And as the story unfolds, the first person that he meets when he gets to Padandrium or Syria was Rachel. She was Laban's daughter. Laban, by the way, was Rebekah's brother. Now, Jacob, when he first saw Rachel, he fell madly in love with her at first sight. And he was willing to do anything in order to marry her. And so he promised Laban that he would work for him and take care of his flocks for 7 years to pay for the right to marry her. Because when Jacob left home, he left without taking anything with him, really. He was leaving in a hurry. He was getting out of Dodge because his brother had threatened to kill him. And so he hadn't taken a lot of resources financially with him. And so he didn't have anything to offer to a bride. So he promised his soon-to-be father-in-law that he would work 7 years for her hand. But it didn't seem like a long time to Jacob. He was so much in love with Rachel. He was willing to do whatever he needed to do. But on the wedding night, Laban is very deceptive. He switches daughters on Jacob. So when Jacob woke up the next morning, and in the light of the day, he saw that he had just spent the night with Rachel's sister Leah. It wasn't Rachel who was in bed with him. So he was understandably upset. And he goes to Laban and he confronts him and he says, "What are you doing? What did you do to me? I worked 7 years for Rachel and then I end up, and it's not Rachel that I'm married to, it's to your other daughter, Leah." And Laban just says, "Well, it's not our custom to marry off the younger daughter before the older." Well, he didn't say anything about that before the wedding. So it was all deception. That was a cruel thing to do to a person. But Laban says, "Now listen, if you'll finish out the marriage week with Leah, you can have Rachel as well." So here Laban was thinking, well, I'll take care of both of my daughters at the same time. And, it's better to have Jacob married than someone else. So, if you'll just finish out Leah's wedding or marriage week, then you can have Rachel as well. If you'll work another 7 years for me. See how selfish and self-centered that Laban was and how deceptive? But like I said, it all started with the deception of Jacob with his own father. So for 14 years, Jacob worked and served his father-in-law Laban for the right to marry his daughters. But when it came to the completion of those 14 years, well, by this time, Jacob had children. His family was growing, and he needed to be able to take care of his family. And so in Genesis 30:30 it says, "For the little you had before I came has increased greatly." He was talking to his father-in-law. "And Yahweh, the Lord, has blessed you since my coming. But now, when am I to provide for my own house too?" So after working 14 years at the same job for his father-in-law. He's saying, now it's time I need to provide for my own family. And you know that God has blessed you ever since I came. You just had a little bit when I got here, but it increased greatly since the time I've been here. But Laban didn't want Jacob to leave, so he says, well, you stay here and you work for me. And he told Jacob, I have diligently watched that Yahweh, the Lord, has blessed me for your sake. So he asked Jacob, please stay and just name your wages. So over the next 6 years, whenever Laban saw how much Jacob was prospering and thriving, he would change his wages. He was hoping to curb Jacob's success because he was accumulating more wealth than Laban was. He was given a certain amount of the flocks, and those flocks were multiplying, but here was Laban's and they weren't. And so he changed Jacob's wages 10 different times. If he would say, now you have the speckled sheep or the flock, or you have the speckled and spotted. He just kept changing the type of sheep or goat that Jacob could have. But every time that he would say, well, you have the speckled sheep, well, those speckled sheep would multiply greatly and they would exceed what was in the flocks of Laban. So Laban just didn't like that. So he kept changing his wages 10 times. So it says in Genesis 30:43, thus the man Jacob increased very much and had many flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So Jacob was becoming very wealthy. Now, finally, Laban's sons, they became envious and jealous, and they felt threatened by Jacob's accomplishments. And they believed that Jacob was jeopardizing their future inheritance, in fact. So in verse 1 of chapter 31, it says, Jacob heard the words of Laban's son saying, Yaakov, or Jacob, has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father, he has made all this wealth. They were basically saying that Jacob was stealing from their father. He wasn't. He was taking what his father allowed him to have, and it was multiplying. That wasn't stealing. It was God's blessings that were upon Jacob. But again, the attitude of Laban's sons had changed drastically, and they were looking with an evil eye towards Jacob or Yaakov instead of, here was their brother-in-law, and, now they were not liking the fact that he was prospering and that he was getting rich. And then Laban's attitude also had changed towards Jacob. It said in verse 2, and Jacob would look at the face of Laban and see that it was not towards him as before. Sometimes people are envious of what you have or what you've been able to accomplish. If you've accomplished something, or if you're financially better off than they are, then it makes other people upset and envious. I don't know what goes through people's minds. I was just at a store yesterday, and I was getting checked out. And the cashier was very pleasant, very nice to the customer in front of me. But when it came to me, she didn't say a word. And then she was ringing up a box of chocolates that I had, and she says, well, you know that this was not on sale, don't you? And it's like, I didn't say a word. I was just standing there. I hadn't, I don't know why her attitude changed from one customer to the next. What, she didn't like my looks, or I didn't say a word. I was not complaining. I hadn't brought anything up. I said, well, isn't it $2? No, I didn't expect it to be on sale. I didn't even bring the subject up. But sometimes just people look at you and they make certain judgments of you, and they can treat you differently than they treat other people. And so for Laban, his attitude changed towards Jacob, as well as his sons. So, it was at that point, it was time for Jacob to leave. Things were just not going good. I mean, the atmosphere, the environment, the work environment was not good. Have you ever been in a situation like that? And then, in verse 3 it said, and Yahweh, the Lord, said to Yaakov, or Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I am with you. God speaks to Jacob and says, it's time for you to go. Sometimes it's like the scripture where it says that talks about the eagle and how it stirs up the nest. The eagle will stir up its nest when it's time for the baby eaglets to begin to fly and to spread their wings, to get out of the nest, to start developing and starting to become the eagle that is meant to be, to learn how to soar like an eagle. And so the mother eagle will put briars and thorns in the nest, and it's not as comfortable as it was before, because originally she would put things that were soft inside the nest so that the baby eaglet would be comfortable and wouldn't feel pain or suffering. But once it was time for them to grow up and get out of the nest, then that's when she'd put briars or thorns in there. And sometimes that's the way it is in our lives as well. Sometimes change is inevitable. So Jacob had a talk with his wives, because if he was going to leave, they had never left home. They had never known anywhere but where they were in Padandrium. And for them to go and pick up their belongings and leave their father and brothers and their hometown and all that, he had to have their support. So he said to them, I see your father's face, that it's not towards me as before, but the Elohim, the mighty God of my father, has been with me. And you know that I've served your father with all my strength. So he wanted them to support and encourage and endorse what he was going to initiate. This was going to be a major change for them. And they had to understand his reasons for wanting to leave. And he wanted them to agree with it. Because, if you're divided, if you're not in agreement together, this could be very chaotic, very difficult to do. So they had to be in agreement for this to work smoothly and without resistance. So as we begin a new year, what lessons can we learn from this story? Well, number one, sins have consequences. In this case, deception breeds deception. And in this case, Jacob was under a curse instead of a blessing. This curse continued down through the generations, because we know as the story even progresses beyond this, that when Jacob does get back to the land of promise and he has 12 sons, that 10 of his sons deceived their father into believing that that Joseph is dead, their other brother. Remember that story. So Jacob is being deceived by his own sons later on. So it has this sin of deception continues on in the family line. And even in Jacob's son Judah, when he's deceived by Tamar, his daughter-in-law. So deception is running through this family line. And if you don't break that curse, it's going to continue. So somewhere along the line, somebody has to break that generational curse. Number 2, integrity and character matter. Integrity and character matter. Jacob became a man of his word, and he kept his promises. He did what he said he would do with Laban. And as a result, the Elohim, the mighty God of his father, had been with him. He very diligently took care of his father's sheep, his flocks. And he told his wives, I have served your father with all my strength. In other words, he gave his work his all. He didn't become bitter. He didn't hold back, even though he'd been cheated and treated unfairly many times. You know, he didn't have a bad attitude. He went out there and did his job. And if his wages were changed, he just trusted the Lord that even in the change of those wages, that God would multiply and bless him. And he did, 10 different times. Number 3, change is inevitable, many times necessary, and it can be divinely inspired. You know, I've faced many changes in my lives, but here we're talking about it was divinely inspired, because in verse 3 it said, and Yahweh the Lord said to Yaakov, or Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I am with you. So even the Lord was saying to Yaakov, or Jacob, that it's time to go. It's time to move. It's time to go on. And think about the different times that you face change in your own lives. You know, when you are a child and you go to school, that's a big change. When you finish high school, whether you go to college or if you get a job, your first job, I mean, that's a big change. When you get married, or when you have children or grandchildren, or you change locations, you move from one location to the other, one state to another, even other countries, if you're in the military or something like that. So jobs will change, relationships change. Those that are in the ministry, those ministries will change. Churches may change. You may go to different churches. But there's a right way and there's a wrong way of going about it. For Jacob, Yaakov, the Lord spoke to him and said it's time to go. And God places different situations in your path to let you know that, yeah, it's time to change. I know when I was working that the Lord began to deal with me that it was time to retire. I took early retirement. But you got to understand that I'm not the type of person that just likes to sit around and do nothing. I'm not somebody that likes to be idle. And so that would be a drastic change for me. And but the circumstances that I was facing, the environment that I was in, was just not very pleasant for me. It was very, I'm not sure what the right word is, but it just was not a pleasant experience for me. There were just a lot of things that were going on that just did not make it a pleasure to go to work. And so the Lord said, it's time to change. I said, okay. There was a time when the Lord said to get a scooter, and I was going, what? And so that was a change. So there are things that the Lord may inspire us to do that will bring about change. And change is sometimes necessary, and sometimes it's for the better. I remember when I was working at Mastercraft, one thing that the management kept harping on was change, 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 because of the environment in the textile industry. For those in the South, that the textile industry was the main industry in our little small communities. And then when business owners began to take their businesses overseas to Mexico or China, then it certainly just destroyed our little villages, our mill villages in these southern states. I mean, it really was devastating for a lot of people. That's all they had known in their lives. And so at Mastercraft, they were saying, change, change, change. We're in an environment. We're no longer the super company that we once were. There's a lot of competition out there, and we've got to change the way we do things so that we can be more cost effective and we can reduce our costs so that we can stay competitive in the world or in the environment that we're in. So they were saying, you've got to change the way you do things. But we got to say that change is not without its challenges and its drama. Many people want to cling to that which is familiar, even though it might not be for the best. There are people that are in a bad relationship and they don't want to change because they don't want to be alone. It may be bad, but, they just don't want to face being out there without someone, even though it may be an abusive situation. Change can be painful. The separation of relationships can be hard. It can be messy. It can be difficult. Laban didn't want Jacob to go. And Jacob knew that. He didn't even bring it up to Laban, that he was even thinking about it. Laban selfishly knew that he had benefited financially from having Jacob around him. God had blessed him because of Jacob. And he possessively did not want to lose his daughters and his grandchildren. Now, Jacob, on the other hand, he didn't want to confront Laban. He didn't want to tell Laban what his plans were. He just wanted to run away, get away while Laban was occupied elsewhere. But that didn't work. It only made the eventual confrontation that much worse, probably. That is, had not the Lord intervened in the situation. For Laban, when he found out that Jacob and his wives and children and all that he had, his flocks and herds, that they had packed up and they left without letting him know, well, he got together, and he started pursuing them, and he overtook Jacob. And he told him, he said, I have the power to harm you. But last night, the God of your father said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. So if God hadn't spoken to him in a dream, it could have been bad. Now here's the way another version says this. It is in the power of my hand to do evil to you, Jacob. But the Elohim, the mighty God of your father, spoke to me last night in a dream, saying, guard yourself that you do not speak to Yaakov or Jacob, either good or evil. So Jacob and his family did eventually make it back to his relatives in the land of promise, which was, of course, necessary for the destiny of the future nation of Israel. But through all the ups and downs, the trials and the temptations, Jacob finally made it back home, back to where he belonged. But like I said, it was 20 years of trials, of temptations, of difficulties, of challenges before he made it back to his destiny, back to where he belonged. And so, as we begin this new year, know that we're going to be facing challenges. What will 2019 bring to us? We've saw since President Trump has been elected that there was one prophetess who said, that God wants Trump to be our president, but we'll never have a normal day while he's in office. It's going to be challenging. And we've seen many challenges. The president has had opposition ever since he took office. And so we've seen many challenges that have taken place. But despite it all, the Lord has been with our president, and we have seen many good changes. Jobs coming back into our country, the situation in North Korea, the pulling of our troops out of Syria, things like this that we never dreamed would be possible, but they're happening. But it's not without our challenges. Yeah, change is inevitable. But I think it takes us to the words of one of our most beloved hymns. And I think it's the third verse where it says, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Despite the changes in our lives, despite all the dangers, toils, and snares that comes along our path, it is God's grace that has brought us this far, and He will lead us to our destination. So we can praise and thank Him and put our trust in Him. That yes, change can be hard, it can be difficult, it can be challenging. But sometimes it is inspired by God, and God will use it for our good. So I just pray God's blessing upon you for this new year. Amen.